Ellie Hurley hurried through the busy city streets. The cold morning air bit at her face as she adjusted her scarf, trying to fend off the discomfort. This big city, with its crowded streets and tall buildings, was everything Ellie had always wanted while growing up in a small town. But now, after living here for a few months, something inside her still felt out of place. Ellie had moved to the big city right after graduating with honors from law school. Coming from a small town where everyone knew each other, where people waved at one another, and neighbors cared about each other's well-being, she struggled to adjust to the impersonal pace of the metropolis. Her mother, Linda, had always taught her the value of empathy and caring for others, a legacy Ellie carried with her. But in the big city, things were different. Everyone seemed in a rush, with no time to stop or care for others. What bothered her the most was the indifference toward homeless people. Every day, as she walked to work, Ellie passed dozens of people living on the sidewalks, ignored by the constant flow of pedestrians. Most people seemed not to notice their existence. This disturbed her deeply. That morning in particular, Ellie was especially restless. As she approached the bakery she usually frequented, she spotted a man sitting on the sidewalk. He was hunched over, his hands in the pockets of his dirty coat, and his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world rested on them. His torn clothes and disheveled hair revealed a hard life. Ellie hesitated for a moment, but something about this man made her stop. She entered the bakery as usual and, when ordering her coffee, added an extra sandwich to her order. It was an impulsive decision, but it felt right at the moment. As she left the bakery, she walked toward the man with a mix of nervousness and determination. She knew she couldn't change his life with a single gesture, but she felt she had to do something. "Hi," she said with a timid smile, holding out the sandwich. "Are you hungry?" The man slowly looked up. His eyes were deep, surrounded by wrinkles that seemed to tell stories of suffering. He glanced at the sandwich and then at Ellie, as if surprised that someone had stopped. "Thank you," he murmured in a hoarse voice, taking the sandwich with trembling hands. Ellie felt strangely emotional. She didn't know what it was about this man, but something about him touched her. Maybe it was his eyes, filled with pain and exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that, in a sea of indifference, she had chosen to see him. "I'm Ellie," she said, wanting to fill the heavy silence. The man just nodded but didn't say his name. There was something in his expression that suggested he was trapped somewhere else, in a distant place within himself. "Well, I hope this helps," she said, forcing a smile before continuing on her way. As she walked away, Ellie couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. The image of the man, curled up on the sidewalk, stayed with her. Something about him moved her in a way she couldn't explain. She knew the city was full of stories like his, but for some reason, this man seemed different. For the rest of her walk to work, Ellie found herself reflecting on how things were different in her hometown. There, people helped each other, always ready to lend a hand. In the big city, it seemed like humanity was lost between the concrete and asphalt. But on that day, Ellie chose to believe that a simple act of kindness could make a difference, even if just for a brief moment. In the days that followed, Ellie continued her daily routine, but now something had changed. Every morning, as she passed the bakery, she saw the same man sitting on the sidewalk, always with a distant look, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Each time she saw him, Ellie felt a kind of internal push. She didn't exactly know why, but the man's presence unsettled her, stirring emotions she couldn't explain. Ellie began bringing him food more often. Sometimes it was just a sandwich or a bottle of water. Other times, she tried to start a conversation, ask his name, or learn more about his life. At first, he seemed suspicious, reticent. His answers were short, monosyllabic. But Ellie was persistent, and gradually, a small crack formed in the man's wall of silence. "My name is Lucius," he said one morning after a long silence between them. Ellie was surprised. It was the first time he had said more than a simple thank you. "Lucius," Ellie repeated, feeling the name resonate strangely in her mind. "That's a beautiful name. I don't hear it often." Lucius shrugged, indifferent. "It was my grandfather's name," he said without much enthusiasm. I didn't choose it, but here we are. Ellie smiled, trying to lighten the mood. I'm Ellie. How did you end up here, Lucius? He hesitated, his eyes drifting to the street's movement in front of him as if searching for an answer. It's a long story, he murmured. I used to be different, a man with a life, a family, but I lost everything. It was a long time ago. Those words echoed in Ellie's thoughts, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. The silence between them felt heavy with a sense of mourning. She knew there was more to Lucius's story, something deeper that he wasn't ready to share. Maybe he never would be. I also come from a small family, she said, trying to build a connection. My mother raised me alone. My father, he disappeared when I was very young. I don't know much about him. Lucius slowly turned his head to look at her. There was something in his eyes that seemed to change, as if a fragile thread had been pulled. Disappeared? He asked, his voice sounding distant. Yes, Ellie responded, her tone light but tinged with sadness. My mother never talked much about him. All I know is that he left us when I was a baby. She always said he was a good man, but he got lost in alcohol, and then never came back. Lucius's expression hardened for a moment. He shook his head slightly, as if absorbing that information with a weight Ellie couldn't fully understand. That happens, he said in a hoarse voice. Sometimes people get lost. And they can't always find their way back. Ellie noticed a subtle shift in his posture but decided not to push. She didn't like talking much about her father either, it was an open wound that had never fully healed. In the days that followed, their conversations continued. Lucius seemed a bit more comfortable each morning, revealing small fragments of his past. He mentioned that he had a daughter, though he didn't go into much detail about her. Her name was Ellie, like yours, he said one day, his voice filled with sadness. Ellie's heart raced for a moment, but she tried to stay calm. What a coincidence, she said with a light smile, though her mind was now filled with questions. Coincidences happen, she thought, but this seemed too much to be just one. The name Lucius sounded vaguely familiar, and his story of a lost daughter echoed Ellie's own life in a disturbing way. In the following days, Ellie couldn't stop thinking about their conversations. The coincidence of their shared names left her unsettled, but she tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was more to it, but what if she was just imagining things? After all, her father had disappeared more than 30 years ago. How could this man, dirty and broken, sitting on the streets of the big city, be him? Yet the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Ellie's mind, now filled with doubts, began to wonder if the man she had been helping every morning might be more than just a stranger. That morning, Ellie left home with her mind full of thoughts. The coincidence between her story and Lucius's bothered her more with each passing day, but she tried to push the idea away. After all, the man her father had been, at least according to the few memories her mother, Linda, had shared, seemed completely different from the broken man Ellie had found on the sidewalk. But the doubt continued to haunt her. When Ellie approached the bakery, she expected to see Lucius as usual, huddled in his corner with the same melancholic air. But to her surprise, he looked different that morning. Very different. Lucius was sitting upright, his hair more groomed, his clothes clean, still worn but now cared for, and his eyes, once distant and downcast, had a shine she had never seen before. Ellie stopped for a second, surprised. She walked slowly toward him, watching him carefully, trying to understand what had changed. Lucius, you look different today, she said as she approached and sat next to him. Lucius looked up, and for the first time, she saw a shy smile on his lips. I'm trying to change, he replied, his voice still hoarse but firmer than before. I needed to do something. I couldn't keep living the way I was. Ellie smiled back, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. You seem, well. What happened? Lucius looked at the ground for a moment, as if gathering the courage to answer. You know, Ellie, after everything we talked about, I started thinking a lot about the life I used to have, about the things I lost. I realized I was tired of living in the shadows of who I used to be. You made me remember who I was. Ellie stayed silent, feeling the weight of those words. She knew there was more behind this change, but she didn't know how to ask. I started to see myself as someone capable of trying again, Lucius continued. A long time ago, I got lost. I lost myself, my family, my life. But meeting you made me want to fight. Ellie felt a lump form in her throat. His words resonated in an unexpected way. There was something deep in all of this, as if Lucius was trying to say more than his words revealed. She wanted to ask more but feared pushing him beyond where he was ready to go. And what gave you the strength to start changing, she asked, trying to sound casual but knowing the answer might be more revealing than she imagined. Lucius looked at her, his eyes now serious. I think I realized that sometimes life gives us a second chance. And not everyone is lucky enough to recognize that opportunity when it comes. I won't waste this one. Ellie nodded, touched by his sincerity. I'm glad you found the strength, Lucius. It's an important step. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the flow of people rushing by on the streets. Ellie sensed that Lucius wanted to say something more, but he seemed hesitant. She was also caught up in her own thoughts. The suspicion that he might be her father, the coincidence of the names, the similarities, it was becoming hard to ignore. Do you still think about your daughter? Ellie suddenly asked, surprised by her own question. Lucius looked away and took a deep breath. I think about her every day. Time passes, but the pain of losing her never goes away. I wonder how she's doing, if she's okay, if she ever managed to forgive me, even without knowing what happened. Ellie felt a knot form in her throat. And do you think she'd like to see you again? Lucius looked at her for a long time, as if measuring his words. I don't know. I'd like to think so. But after everything I did, I'm not sure I deserve that. Ellie, feeling a wave of emotions, almost voiced her suspicions at that moment. She almost asked directly if he was the man she was beginning to believe he was. But something inside her held back. Maybe it wasn't the right time. Maybe Lucius needed to come to that conclusion on his own. I think if she knew how hard you're trying, she'd be proud, Ellie said with a soft smile. Lucius returned the smile, but there was a glimmer of sadness in his eyes. I hope so. At that moment, Ellie realized that something had changed not just in Lucius but also in her. She could no longer ignore the growing suspicion that Lucius was her father. At the same time, she knew she was at an emotional crossroads. If he really was who she suspected, what would she do? Could she forgive him for all the years of absence? Was she ready to hear the truth? She knew that soon, she would have to confront this question. The sky was gray that afternoon, and a light drizzle fell over the city. Ellie walked with Lucius along a quiet street, far from the usual bustle of downtown. Their conversations were becoming more intimate, but the weight of what remained unsaid hung between them. Ellie knew something was about to be revealed, and Lucius seemed on the verge of confessing more about his past. The silences between their words grew longer and more meaningful. Lucius seemed more restless than usual. His expression, which had shown more calm and hope in recent weeks, now returned to displaying a trace of melancholy. Ellie sensed that he was about to share something important but waited for him to do so in his own time. After a few minutes of silent walking, Lucius stopped by a bench in a small park. He gestured for them to sit, and Ellie followed his lead, sitting beside him. A light breeze made her pull her coat tighter, but the cold she felt came from within. Lucius stared at the ground, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them or perhaps trying to find the right words. Ellie watched him, her heart beating faster, as if she knew something important was about to happen. Ellie, he began, his voice low and hesitant. I think it's time you know more about who I am. About the life I had, before I lost everything. Ellie didn't respond immediately, only nodding. She felt that Lucius was finally ready to tell the truth. I wasn't always like this, he continued, his voice almost a whisper. I had a life, a family. I had a wife, Linda, and a daughter named Ellie. At the mention of her mother's name, Ellie felt the world around her stop. It was as if time had slowed. She stared at Lucius, her mind trying to process what she had just heard. The confirmation she had feared and, at the same time, longed for was there, in his words. Lucius looked at her with eyes heavy with pain, sensing the change in her expression. "I know it can't be a coincidence," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "When you told me your name, I had to accept that fate had put me back in the path of my own daughter." Ellie blinked, trying to hold back the tears that were already forming in her eyes. You're really my father?" she asked, her voice trembling, as if she still needed to hear the confirmation again, no matter how obvious it was. Lucius nodded, his own voice breaking with emotion. "Yes. It's me." Ellie brought her hands to her face, covering her eyes for a moment as she tried to control the tears that finally fell. It was a mix of happiness and pain, joy at finally meeting the man she had spent her life imagining, and sadness at knowing he had been out there, lost on the streets, for so long. "I thought you had left us," Ellie said, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother, she never talked much about you. I grew up thinking you had simply abandoned us." Lucius shook his head, his eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want to leave you. I was drowning in addiction, in alcohol. I lost my job, and I felt like a failure as a husband, as a father. I thought you'd be better off without me. And in the end, I completely lost myself." Ellie wiped away her tears, still trying to process the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. "My mother always said you were a good man, but that you got lost. I never knew how. And now I find you here, after all these years." Lucius looked at her with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of all the years lost. "I never stopped thinking about you, Ellie. I thought about coming back so many times, but I was too ashamed. Every day on the streets reminded me of the man I used to be, and how much I had failed you." Ellie took a deep breath, trying to regain control. Do you still think about her? My mother?" Lucius nodded slowly. "I think about her every day. Linda, she was my light for so many years. And I threw it all away. The guilt consumed me so much that I thought I didn't deserve to come back." Ellie felt her heart tighten as she heard this. It was hard to reconcile the man in front of her, so full of regret and loss, with the distant figure she had spent her life imagining. "She moved on," Ellie said softly. "She built a life for us, but I know it was hard for her. Sometimes I saw the sadness in her eyes, but I could never fully understand it. Now I do." Lucius closed his eyes, as if absorbing each word with pain. "I deserve her anger. I know that. I don't expect her to forgive me, nor do I think I have the right to ask." Ellie looked at him, and something inside her ignited. The anger and resentment she had felt for so many years began to dissolve in the face of the sincerity and pain in Lucius's eyes. He wasn't the man she had imagined, the one who had simply abandoned them. He was a man who had gotten lost, who had made mistakes and paid dearly for them. Maybe you should see her," Ellie said, hesitantly. I don't know how she'll react, but I think she deserves to know what happened. And maybe you deserve the chance to ask for forgiveness." Lucius looked at Ellie in surprise. "Do you think she could forgive me?" Ellie shrugged, giving him a sad smile. "I don't know. But I think forgiveness begins when the truth is told. If you're truly sorry, she deserves to know." Lucius nodded slowly. "I would do anything to make things right, even if it's impossible to go back. I don't know if she still has space for me in her life, but I have to try." Ellie looked at him, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. Maybe this is the start of a new path. For all of us. They stood up from the bench and walked in silence, both aware that, although the revelation had been painful, it had opened a door that had long been locked. Lucius had found his daughter, and Ellie had found her father. Now, the next step was to face the past, together. Lucius stood at the door of Ellie's apartment, his eyes fixed on the ground as if unsure what to do with his hands. He looked more vulnerable than ever, the visible marks of years of abandonment and loneliness etched into his features. "Ellie, on the other hand, felt a mix of conflicting emotions, the desire to help her father rebuild himself and the fear of what might come next. She knew Lucius's recovery wouldn't be easy. The shadow of addiction ran deep, and while he had started to fight, there was still a long road ahead. "Come in," Ellie said softly, gesturing for him to enter. I know it won't be easy, but I'm here. We'll do this together." Lucius looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and fear at the same time. "I don't know if I deserve this, Ellie. You've already done so much for me, and I don't know if I can give you anything in return." Ellie shook her head. "It's not about what you can give. It's about what you need right now. You can't do this alone, and, in a way, I need this too." Lucius stepped inside, still hesitant, feeling the weight of the moment. Ellie's apartment was cozy, full of life, and Lucius seemed out of place there. He looked around, as if in unfamiliar territory, trying to adapt to the idea of being in a home after so many years on the streets. In the days that followed, Lucius began his journey to recovery, but as Ellie expected, it wasn't a linear process. The first days were filled with hope, with Lucius determined to break free from the addiction that had dragged him into the depths of loss. Ellie helped him find a rehabilitation clinic that could assist him, and he began attending therapy sessions, both individual and group. Conversations with others battling addiction showed Lucius that he wasn't alone, that his struggle was shared by many. But then came the nights. The nights were the worst. Ellie would hear the muffled sounds of Lucius tossing and turning on the couch, his groans of agony as withdrawal gripped his body. The attacks came without warning, chills, sweating, nausea, and an unbearable pain that seemed to rip away any glimmer of hope. During those hours, Lucius would cry out in frustration and despair. The withdrawal was relentless, and Lucius felt like he was being torn apart inside. One night, Ellie woke to the sound of Lucius gasping violently. She rushed to the living room and found him curled up on the couch, trembling uncontrollably. His face was pale, and his eyes wide with fear. Ellie knelt beside him, not knowing how to ease his suffering but willing to stay by his side no matter how hard it was. "It'll pass, Dad," she said, trying to stay calm. "I'm here. You'll get through this." Lucius looked at her, tears streaming down his face. "I can't do it, Ellie. I'm not strong enough. This is bigger than me." Ellie took his hands, squeezing them tightly. "You are strong enough. And you're not alone. I'm here. I'll be here as long as it takes. I won't let you fall." In that moment, Ellie realized that Lucius's recovery wouldn't be a battle he would fight alone. It was a battle for both of them. They were connected in ways neither of them could have imagined, and it was that connection that would carry them through the darkest times. As the weeks went by, there were ups and downs. Lucius had days when he seemed filled with hope, committed to his recovery, attending therapy sessions with determination. At times, he almost resembled the man Ellie had imagined her father could have been, hopeful, capable, and with a clearer vision of the future. But then there were the emotional relapses. There were days when Lucius would fall back into spirals of guilt, reliving the mistakes of the past. He would talk about Linda, about what he had lost, and often sank into regret. "I threw it all away," he would say in a low voice, shaking his head as if talking to himself. "Linda, I lost you both, and there's no going back." Ellie would try to ease his pain, reminding him that what mattered was that he was trying now. "The past can't be undone, but you have the present. And I'm here, Dad. I'm here to see you move forward." As the days turned into weeks, Lucius began taking small but significant steps in his recovery. With Ellie's support and the help of the clinic's professionals, he started opening up more about his life, confronting his fears, and finding small victories. The moments of withdrawal became less intense, and the shadow of addiction, though still present, began to fade. Lucius also began rediscovering small pleasures. Sometimes, he and Ellie would go for walks in the park, where they would talk about simple things, the weather, the blooming flowers, the childhood memories Ellie would share. It was during these walks that Lucius saw what he still had, a chance, a future, and a daughter who, despite everything, was willing to forgive him. "You've given me more than I could ever ask for, Ellie," Lucius said one day as they watched the birds in the park. "I don't know how you can look at me and not hate me." Ellie sighed, holding Lucius's arm as they walked. "I spent a long time being angry at you. And I admit that anger is still there, somewhere. But, the truth is, more than anger, I've always missed you. I don't think I ever got over that. And now I have a chance to get to know you. Not as the man you were before, but as the man you're trying to be now." Lucius stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I can never give you back the years I lost, but I'll do my best to give you everything of me from now on. Thank you for not giving up on me." Ellie smiled, her eyes also filled with tears. "We still have a long way to go, but I'm here. I always will be." The day had finally arrived. After weeks of preparation and countless moments of doubt and hesitation, Lucius was ready to take the next step, reuniting with Linda. Ellie knew this would be the hardest moment for him, but also the most necessary. The reunion with the woman he had once loved and, in a way, still loved, was a key piece in Lucius's journey toward redemption. For Ellie, it was also an opportunity to try and heal her mother's wounds, even if forgiveness didn't come easily. Tension was palpable in the air as Ellie and Lucius made their way to Linda's house. The path, familiar to Ellie, seemed to stretch on with every step. Lucius walked beside her in silence, his face tight with an expression that mixed fear and hope. He nervously adjusted his coat, as if trying to prepare for what was to come, but nothing seemed enough. Ellie looked at him and, with a light touch on his arm, tried to calm him. "It'll be okay, Dad. I know it's hard, but the truth is what we need now." Lucius nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the sidewalk in front of him. I don't know what to expect. She would be right to hate me. After everything I did. I can't blame her if she rejects me. She might react in many ways," Ellie said, carefully choosing her words. "But the important thing is that you're here, trying. And that's what matters now." When they finally reached Linda's house, Lucius stopped in front of the door. He looked at the house's facade with eyes full of memories, some good, some painful. It was there that his life had split in two, where he had made the choice to walk away. The fear of facing the consequences of his mistakes tightened in his chest, but Ellie was by his side, offering the support he needed. Ellie rang the doorbell, and they both waited in silence. The seconds seemed to drag on. Lucius stood still, as if about to collapse, and Ellie felt the tension grow as the sound of her mother's footsteps approached the door. The door opened slowly, and Linda appeared, surprise spreading across her face when she saw Ellie. "Ellie, dear," she began, but her voice faltered when her eyes landed on Lucius, standing just behind her daughter. The shock was visible on Linda's face. She froze for a moment, her eyes fixed on the man she hadn't seen in decades. Lucius looked thinner, older, but the familiar features were still there. It was him. The man she had once loved, the man who had left her to raise their daughter alone. "Lucius," the word left Linda's lips like a whisper, filled with a mix of disbelief and pain. She stepped back, as if his presence had pushed her away. Lucius, his eyes filled with tears, took a small step forward, but his voice trembled as he tried to speak. "Linda. Forgive me." For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Ellie, standing to the side, watched her mother closely. She knew Linda's reaction could go in any direction. The pain of the past, the weight of abandonment, it was all present in that moment, and Ellie didn't know what to expect. Linda looked at Lucius for a few more seconds, and then the shock began to dissolve into anger. "Forgive you?" Her voice rose a little, filled with resentment. "Do you think you can just show up after all these years and ask for forgiveness?" Lucius lowered his head, unable to look directly at her. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I hurt you, hurt our family. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I had to try. I had to tell you that I'm sorry. That I regret everything." Linda's face was etched with years of repressed pain. Ellie saw the tears begin to form in her mother's eyes. Linda crossed her arms, as if trying to shield herself from the avalanche of emotions. You have no idea what it was like to raise a daughter alone. To watch her life go on without a father, to try and explain your disappearance. I had to be strong for her, while you got lost. Ellie looked at her mother, feeling the weight of those words. She knew how much Linda had suffered in silence, and at that moment, it all seemed to be coming to the surface. But she also knew that Lucius was no longer the man who had walked away. I know, Linda, Lucius said, his voice broken. I know I can't fix what I did. But I'm trying to be someone better, someone worthy of being here. I want to be a father to Ellie, and I wanted a chance to show that I can change. Linda shook her head, the tears now falling freely. She looked at Ellie, as if seeking some kind of answer. Ellie took a small step forward, gently placing her hand on her mother's arm. He's trying, Mom. He's been through a lot, and I'm not excusing what he did. But he's fighting to change. And I think if he didn't try, we'd always be left wondering, what if? Linda looked at her daughter and then at Lucius. The weight of the moment was clear on her face. It was as if the wall she had built over the years was starting to crack. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. Finally, Linda took a step to the side, making room at the door. I don't know what will happen, she said, her voice still trembling. But, come in. Let's talk. Lucius lifted his gaze, surprised and emotional. He nodded slowly and followed Linda inside the house, with Ellie right behind, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. They sat in the living room, the silence still present but now less tense. Lucius began to tell the story of how he had gotten lost in addiction, how he had tried to find strength but had failed countless times. He spoke about the nights on the streets, the regret that consumed him, and the guilt he had carried all these years. And finally, he told how meeting Ellie had motivated him to try and be a better man. Linda listened in silence, her trembling hands resting in her lap. The anger was still there, as was the pain, but something else was emerging, a small spark of understanding, of acceptance. What you did still hurts, she said, her voice rough with emotion. But, maybe, with time, we can find a way to move forward. Lucius nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'll accept anything, Linda. I just want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my days trying to make up for what I did. Linda took a deep breath and looked at Ellie, who watched the scene with a tight heart but full of hope. We have a lot to work on, Linda said with a small smile. But maybe, just maybe, we can try. Ellie smiled back, her eyes brimming with tears. In that moment, she felt that despite everything, her family was beginning to rebuild itself. It was a new beginning for all of them. Months had passed since the reunion between Lucius, Ellie, and Linda. The path to reconciliation hadn't been easy, as Ellie expected, the wounds of the past didn't heal overnight. But to her surprise and relief, the family was slowly finding a way to move forward. Lucius had continued his recovery with determination, facing each day as a new opportunity to rebuild his life. Although he still faced challenges, he now had something he hadn't had in a long time: hope. Ellie and Linda had been his anchors throughout the process, offering support and encouraging words whenever he faltered. That morning, the sun shone softly through the windows of Linda's house. It was a special day for all of them because Lucius was celebrating an important milestone in his recovery: 6 months of sobriety. The small achievement felt monumental to Lucius, who had never imagined he would get this far. Ellie had arrived early at her mother's house to help organize a simple but meaningful lunch. It was a way to celebrate Lucius's progress and, at the same time, an opportunity for all of them to reflect on how much they had changed since the reunion. As Ellie walked into the living room, she saw her mother setting the table with plates and silverware. Linda seemed lighter than she had a few months ago, though she still carried a certain caution. Her relationship with Lucius was slowly being rebuilt, based on honest conversations and small demonstrations of trust. It wasn't easy, and both knew it would take time. But there was an openness, a space for forgiveness and mutual understanding. Lucius, for his part, was on the porch, gazing at the garden. He looked healthier than ever. His clothes were more put together, his face clean, and his posture more confident. There was a serenity in his eyes that Ellie hadn't seen since the day she had met him on the sidewalk outside the bakery. Ellie approached and hugged him from behind. "How are you feeling, Dad?" Lucius smiled, still admiring the garden. "I feel grateful for everything. I never imagined I'd be here, with you and your mother, after all these years." Ellie sat beside him at the small table on the porch, where the morning sun gently warmed the space around them. "You fought for this, Dad. It was hard, but you made it." Lucius sighed, as if still processing the journey he had been through. "It's still hard, Ellie. I think about what I lost, about what could have been. But at the same time, I know I'm lucky. I have you too, and that's more than I could ever ask for." They sat in silence for a moment, enjoying the tranquility of the day. For Lucius, every second there, with his daughter by his side and knowing that Linda was inside the house, was a victory. He knew there was still much to be done, the past couldn't be erased, and the emotional scars were far from disappearing completely. But the simple fact of being with his family again was a source of peace he never thought he would feel again. "Do you think she will ever be able to forgive me completely?" Lucius asked, his voice hesitant. Ellie looked at her father and gave him a gentle smile. "I think forgiveness is a journey, Dad. You two are giving each other a chance, and that's already a start. Time will show the rest." Lucius nodded, accepting her words. He knew the road with Linda would be long, but he was willing to wait as long as it took. What mattered to him was that he was there, present, sober, and ready to keep fighting for his place in their lives. At lunchtime, the atmosphere was simple but full of meaning. Linda, Ellie, and Lucius sat at the table, talking about the future, making small plans, and occasionally sharing memories from the past. The laughter started timidly but soon filled the space with a warmth they hadn't experienced in a long time. Finally, Lucius raised his glass of water, smiling with emotion as he toasted to the new chance life had given him. "I know we still have a lot to rebuild," he said, looking at Linda and Ellie. "But I'm grateful for this second chance. And I promise I won't waste it." Linda smiled, a light but genuine smile. "We're all learning to start over," she said, with a touch of tenderness that, just a few months ago, had seemed impossible. Ellie, with tears in her eyes, raised her glass too. "To new beginnings," she said, full of emotion. "And to the strength of never giving up on each other." They toasted together, in a simple gesture but full of meaning. It was the start of a new phase for all of them. A future that, although uncertain and still under construction, carried with it the promise of something better. Reconciliation was underway, and love, despite its imperfections, was the foundation keeping them united. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.